Morning, everybody. No, it's not a snow day. And welcome to the news agenda with me, Fleet Street Fox. And today I'm joined by the Mirror's assistant editor, Jason Beattie. Morning, Jason.
Morning, Susie. We've got snow here. Yeah, southeast London. We have snow.
Yeah, well, we've got it in Kent as well. The daffodils are very, very sad. Hopefully it won't stay around too long. Now, this is the People's Pay-Per-View, so get into the comments, ask us your questions. We'll do our best to answer them for you. You are the third guest, or the second guest, depending how you're counting this. So get into the comments and take part. Those of you listening later on podcast, you're just going to have to get your boots on and go to school, whether you like it or not. So what have we got for you today? Well, the Mirror has splashed on the opening statements of the prosecution in the trial over the murder of 9-year-old Olivia Pratt-Korbel, alleged shot in her own hallway when a gunman burst in while trying to shoot a gangland target, allegedly. And it makes for very uncomfortable reading, not least that headline. And we can't discuss it here for contempt of court reasons because there's a trial ongoing. But it's worth your time reading in full. And of course, we will keep you up to date with how the trial goes. And we'll probably discuss it by the time there's a verdict at the end. But in the meantime, we have to start, most unusually for us, on what looks suspiciously like good news. Steady on, everybody. But on page 2 of today's paper, it's revealed that we may be inching closer to a pay deal for the very many NHS staff who have been on strike. Jason, can you take us through this? Is there really light at the end of the tunnel?
From what I've heard, Susie, the Health Secretary, Steve Barclay, has been trying to get money from the Treasury for some time to resolve this. He realizes how damaging it is. They particularly want to deal with the nurses because the Tories went into this thinking with a kind of slightly Thatcherite mentality, we're stand up to the strikers, we're come down heavy on these unions, bringing the country to a halt, and then found actually the public opinion, as poll after poll showed, that there was a lot of sympathy for the nurses. Having realised this, Barclay was then told to try and resolve it after having originally refused to talk, which we'll come back to. Now, there's two major questions here. Yeah, one, can he get the money out of the Treasury? And if he can't get the money out of the Treasury, where does it come from? So if it's going to come from within the NHS budget, that's very good for nurses who deserve a pay rise. As we've reported frequently, or their salary is at a time of major kind of cost of living crisis is not sufficient. They are using food banks. They are unable to afford to drive to work. They can't put food on their children's table. The case is quite clear why they need a pay rise. By comparison with nurses in almost every other major European country, they're paid extraordinarily badly. So can they get the money? And if it comes from the NHS budget, does that mean it comes from elsewhere? And does that mean they're kind of robbing Peter to pay Paul?
Exactly. What is the NHS budget not being used to pay for if it's funding the nurses?
Yeah. If they start taking it away from other services, that's problematic. So everything would be about the kind of the resources. Then you come back to this issue, which I kind of briefly raised, of why didn't they do this earlier?
Exactly. It kind of wonders why they're doing it now. What do you think, everybody? Do you think that this is the right thing to do and they must come to a deal? But where do you want that money to come from? Do you want it to come from existing NHS budgets, which, as Labour pointed out yesterday, has had 144,000 cancelled appointments and surgeries because of the strike action? and which they have to find a way to catch up with, as well as all the pandemic backlogs. Because, of course, the government has been refusing to discuss this for months and months, as you said, Jason. So that's why the strikes went ahead. We had nurses, physiotherapists, ambulance drivers, paramedics, midwives, and all these cancellations. Is that what made the government change its mind? The fact that you mentioned that it was they retained public support, but also that the backlog was just getting worse and worse and worse? Or was it the fact that the junior doctors and now even the consultants are balloting to join the strike action?
Well, I mean, if we look at it from I'll try to do this, it's quite hard, but we look at it from a Tory point of view.
Go on, Jason.
I'm going to do my best. It's a very murky world, and it's not much fun doing this deep dive. But for the sake of your program, I'm going to have a go, Susie. So if you look at it from a Tory point of view, they came from what I said, from kind of this kind of like very kind of traditional Thatcherite way of thinking, we stand up to unions because we look tough and it plays well with our audience. That didn't work. There's also an element of they were concerned that if they give ground with one union, then they have to give ground to the others. Now, what they're trying to do here is a little bit of divide and rule. So solve the nurses, but not necessarily solve the other pay disputes. That again could prove to be problematic long term. Let's see.
Yes, well, we'll have to find out, won't we? It will become clear, I'm sure, in time. But how they're going to actually fund it, I think, is the important thing. Because previous nurses' pay rises, which were below inflation, they came from the existing budget, which has led to some of the problems that we've got right now. I think the one that Rishi Sunak ordained as Chancellor was from the existing budget. Now, Marco says the local elections are coming up. So, hey ho, let's shake the money tree. You cynic, Marco. You cynic. Even we haven't suggested that. And we are lifelong career journalists. Maybe Marco's the editor in disguise. Who knows? But yes, there are local elections in May. They don't want strike action going over that time, do they? So maybe that's also played into their thinking. They've got enough problems coming up for the local elections. I suspect there's going to be some other sudden policy announcements just before May to try and move things on a little bit. We'll have to see how it all goes. But the RMT has also suspended strikes at Network Rail. So that's another bit of good news because they've got a deal edging a bit closer as well. But there is still an ambulance strike on March the 20th. So put a big red dot in your calendars, everybody, and don't fall over on March the 20th. Now, keep asking us your questions. What do you think about all these pay deals edging closer? Does it show that strike action works, or does it show that the government has been held to ransom by militant lefties? Do let us know. But first, it's a Tory government, as Jason has pointed out, so it's not all good news, I'm afraid. And on page 8 of yesterday's announcement of what is basically going to be the Tories' next 3-word slogan for the general election: stop the boots. Now, Jason, they've announced a new plan to discourage migrants from crossing the channel in these dinghies. But what are they suggesting exactly? How is this going to work? Because, I mean, they've tried to stop the boats for an awful long time and they haven't managed it yet, have they?
So last year, 45,000 people made the crossing across the channel. The plan is not to go after the gangs or criminal gangs who are behind the people smugglers, but to go for the victims of people smuggling. So if you arrive in the UK as what they term illegally, you will have no right to stay in this country. You will face automatic deportation to where, gosh knows, we'll come on to that. And even if your claim is subsequently found to be justified, as is many of the cases of currently people seeking refuge in this country, you will have no right ever to return here again. It's not subtle, this, Susie.
No.
It's a slightly confected problem in terms of they like to tell us that this is what's the most important issue on the doorstep, and anybody who opposes this plan is out of step with public opinion. I dislike people who try to tell me what public opinion is and isn't in this way, as though they speak for a kind of quiet, silent majority. actually all the polls show the most important issue on the doorstep at the moment is the NHS, followed by the state of the economy, i.e. energy prices. But hey-ho, they've decided this is the issue. And they approach it from the most cynical way, because they invent they stir up the worst instincts in humankind for political advantage.
Yeah.
And that's what makes me so angry, because you could come at this and go, this is a really awful problem, and which people are dying trying to seek refuge in this country. And they're not some homogenous mass. They're not just some all young Albanians. They are desperately sad individual stories behind each of these people, in many, many cases, who have fled countries such as Afghanistan, Syria, and Iraq. And in the case of Afghanistan and Iraq, there are two countries where Britain had led military operations which are partly responsible for these people having to leave those countries. So we have a duty towards them. And yet they bundle them together as using horrifically incendiary and insensitive language, as though it's an invasion or we're being swamped. And then they then exaggerate the problems. One of the most offensive things yesterday, among many offensive things, was Suella Braverman saying there are 100 million people who want to this country and we must stop them. Where's that figure come from?
Yeah.
There's no justification for it. There's no basis in evidence for 100 million.
Yeah.
And then she was asked about it this morning. She said, I have a duty to speak the truth. Well, if you want to speak the truth, tell the story of these people and why they've generally come here and why they've been trafficked and why they're being exploited.
Yes.
And why they need sanctuary, because they've been tortured or they fled conflict or because their lives are at risk because of oppressive regimes. That's the truth. But no. We'll just invent a mystical figure to kind of incite fear and then use this for our own political advantage. It's deeply, deeply depressing.
I think that's been neatly summed up. Thank you, Jason. Now, Ron is neatly summing up, I suppose, the alternative viewpoint and the one that the Conservative Party and the government would like us all to consider and to be thinking about. One of the things that Suella Braverman said is that those who do not support this plan are in some way, that she is backing the silent majority, not those who would, and I quote, betray Britain. So she's kind of implying that if you aren't entirely behind this, you're not patriotic, you're betraying your country. If you're one of those people who doesn't like their immigration idea. Now, Ron says, this is being cruel to be kind. I'm not sure that's actually ever possible, Ron. Just those first four words. Cruelty isn't kindness, and kindness isn't cruelty. And you can't say that it's harder to be cruel to you than it is to be kind. This isn't like you're taking sweets away from a child in order to encourage them to behave better. This is actual cruelty. We don't want any more Manchester Arena bombings. There was inquests heard this week, Ron, actually, or end of last week, that the Manchester Arena bombing took place because of failings by MI5. Yes, the person who conducted it was a Libyan refugee, but as Jason just pointed out, David Cameron was one of those who ordered RAF drones to drop a lot of bombs on Libya for his own political ends, and then went to the square in the Tory Square in the middle of Tripoli, sorry, and shook hands with everybody and got some good PR out of it. And then we did have to accept some Libyan refugees. And then it's the responsibility of our security services to make sure that they're all behaving. The London Bridge bombings, I'm not aware of those being a result of any kind of refugee. Grooming gangs, etc., not a result of those being a result of refugees either. They were the result of actual lawful immigration from countries which had a safe route to get here, etc., while Sir Keir Savile can't define a woman. Sir Keir Starmer, as you're talking about there, and implying that he was responsible somehow for the failure to prosecute Jimmy Savile, had nothing to do with the failure to prosecute Jimmy Savile. One of the biggest reasons there was a failure to prosecute Jimmy Savile was because his victims didn't come forward until after he died. And it made everything very, very difficult to do things before because, the police failed over Jimmy Savile. And it wasn't a case that Keir Starmer really had a chance to do much before Savile died. So I think we've probably dealt with pretty much most of that. For those of you who are wondering how many of these migrants that come across on boats are genuine refugees and not, I can give you some figures. The Home Office doesn't tell you, right? Number one, if the Home Office doesn't want to give you the figure, worry. Number one, right? But there's been some analysis of the figures they have released, and they've managed to kind of reverse engineer it to figure out that about 61% of everyone who comes across on a boat is a definite nailed on refugee, right? There's no issue. That's 61%. So the law which they are proposing means that 61% of those people who are going to be booted out, who are going to be forbidden from ever applying, who are going to be just refused the right to be here, are genuine refugees who have every right to be here and who we have responsibilities towards. 61%. From some countries, like Syria, for example, the rate is much, much higher. 88% of Syrians on those boats are genuine refugees and are given final approved status to settle in this country. So it's not a case that everyone who comes across in those boats is an Albanian. The problem with the Albanians was, I think, only over the past year, and it kind of got sorted out because they did a deal with the Albanian government, and that's done the most to actually stop the Albanian numbers in the refugee boats. Mike says, who, I think is a reference to Ron, who are you being kind to? Not the desperate people in boats, for sure. And doesn't it occur to you that preventing legal routes means more people hiding from the system and likely to turn into radicals? This is kind of the thing that bothers me a bit about this, Jason, aside from the incredible cruelty, is that Sorella Bradman is talking about smashing the business model of those people smuggling gangs who run the boats. And she will do that by stopping their customers getting what they want at the end of the day. And that strikes me as being very, very similar as saying you're going to smash the business model of the drug gangs by arresting the customer. Like, that hasn't worked, has it? How is this going to work? Is this going to deter anybody?
I mean, this is ultimately the reasons it will not work are that it doesn't act as a deterrent. There's a refusal to accept any form of safe routes. We have some safe routes, but they're incredibly difficult to use. I mean, for example, we have a safe route for Afghanistan, but
we left most of them behind.
Just only one person was able to access it in 1 month. I mean, that's the difficulty of these safe routes. But the major problem is we have a backlog of 160,000 people seeking asylum whose cases have not yet been dealt with because of the inefficiency of the Home Office. Now, this is just going to create an even greater backlog, and they are they say they're going to send them, have a duty to send them as quickly as possible to a third country, i.e., this is what I mean by Rwanda. But as I said, there were 45,000 people across the channel last week. Rwanda says at the moment its maximum capacity is 1,000 people they could take. That could rise, they say, in the future. I mean, obviously, just putting aside the ethical question of actually kind of exporting our problem to another country with quite a problematic human rights record, that leaves 44,000 people. Where are they going to be detained? Where are they going to be housed while we process their claims? How much is that going to cost? How does this solve the issue?
And how do you speed up those claims? You have to get them through the system quicker. Yeah. You have fewer spaces. If you want to be fairer, you have to do it quicker as well, because it takes 2-3 years. And why are we detaining everybody who comes for an indefinite, ineffable period of time? This law's got a rule saying that they can hold people for 28 days and then even longer. Some of the people at Manston, which is the last military base, ex-military base they've tried to put people on, have been there for far unlawful periods of time. Can't remember exactly how long. But we, in this country, when someone comes and claims asylum, we don't let them work. We give them 30 quid a week, and you're not allowed to work. And then we spend thousands housing them and looking after them and all the rest of this stuff. Why don't we, seeing as we have an absolute crisis in low-paid jobs and people not able to do them, and plenty of opportunities for people to go and help and do things that we need in this country, why don't we let asylum seekers go and do those low paid, jobs, and start paying taxes, start contributing, start learning English, start assimilating, start being part of things. Because when you detain them and lock them up like that, they're sitting ducks for gangs, aren't they?
Yeah, I was going to point out a lot of the people coming from Syria are actually very skilled and could be very useful in our health service. It's not just low skilled jobs. I find it extraordinary, but there's a well of talent out there. There's a well of goodwill towards this country. There's a well of people who want to start a new life, and we're denying that opportunity to do so.
Yeah, the fact is, if you can afford to pay the people traffickers, you are by definition middle class, right? So this is the Daily Mail reading section of the wider browner world, which Suella Braverman is turning away. Now, Anne Marie says Gary Lineker is 100% right. That's what this despicable, cruel, inhumane refugee policy is, not unlike the Germans in the 1930s. Unfortunately, it's not like an awful lot of countries in the 1930s, including our own. It wasn't just the Nazis that were unkind to refugees. There's a lot of countries that had a problem, especially with those who were fleeing in Europe, and didn't want to accept the refugees from Germany. Mike Maynard says Australia solved their problem by saying all illegal landings would be turned back. It worked. Australia, Mike, is significantly further away from the nearest landmass. What they actually did as well was they interned people on distant Pacific islands in conditions that were incredibly inhumane. And because that's so far away from the Australian mainland and so far away from New York and headquarters of the United Nations, it didn't really get picked up a lot by people outside Australia, unfortunately. And just because Australia does it doesn't mean we have to. Doesn't mean that at all. And part of the reason that we've got this situation with 45,000 people coming here last year, which is only a tenth of what is actually coming to this country legally, to be fair, it's 500,000 come to the country legally. 45,000. Celia says, I have no sympathy for them anymore. I couldn't care less about them. I don't know if you're talking about migrants or the Tory party. Could be either. I'm assuming it's probably migrants. But for me, I think it's probably the Tories. But the fundamental issue here is that the people who want to come have got a really good pull factor, and it's not the 30 quid a week. It's because they speak English, or it's because they've got a family here already. There's an awful lot of family connections. And if you think about it, if any of us, if Putin suddenly decided to drop a nuclear weapon on Norfolk or something, and we all decided to up and go somewhere, we would choose to go to a country where we could speak the language, wouldn't we? As opposed to the Philippines, where it's a bit more difficult to learn Tagalog or something. We'd go to Australia, we'd go to America, we'd go to France because we had a bit of GCSE behind us. We wouldn't go to somewhere that we hadn't learnt the language. So that's why there is this pull factor, and that this law, Jason, doesn't block that, does it? It doesn't stop that. It doesn't solve that particular problem, which is we have historic connections with countries around the world. We've got current moral obligations to some countries around the world and people, and they've got connections to us. That's why they want to come here.
I just want to pick up Cecilia's point, because I get this, and I think it needs addressing, because this is the problem, is that I'm not sure if Cecilia has ever met somebody who's had to seek refuge in this country, and perhaps she should if she hasn't, because I was speaking to somebody the other day who was forced to leave Iran, and they were forced to leave Iran because they'd spoken out against the regime, and they left behind their partner. They had to get out because his brother had been arrested, and his brother was later found to have been tortured and died in Iran. He then left with literally no notice whatsoever, whatever he could get in the backpack to get out of the country. He then travelled in a lorry in freezing conditions with no food across Europe. And then he used what money he had to pay a people smuggler to get across the channel in terrifying conditions. He's very bright. He wants to work. And he was desperate. And when you say, I don't care about them anymore, you should, Celia, because these are people's lives. I mean, if any of us found ourselves in that situation, we want somebody to help us. And I think she needs to sometimes just to think about behind the numbers. Every single one of these cases is usually an individual story where it matters. And that's why you should care, Cecilia.
And why did this person come to Britain, Jason? Why did they not stop in one of the, nice countries they may have passed through on the way through Europe?
They came because they spoke English, as you said earlier. And they also came, I know this sounds maybe naive, they thought we were a country which actually cared about people. And
they hadn't heard of Suella Braverman. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, they thought that we were a country which was, kind of diverse and caring and open and welcoming, and all those things which when they say, as I said right at the top of this, we speak for the British public opinion. We're in tune with British opinion. The British opinion I want to be in tune with is with the generous people, and the kind people, and the welcoming people, and the hospitable people.
Yeah, well, most of the comments that have come up today, it's got to be said, are from people who are feeling less hospitable. But perhaps that's because they're the people who are more likely to shout about things. If you are, a bit more in the middle somewhere, you're not going to speak so much, are you? Darren says, don't let none of them in. Finally, they've grown a backbone. Thanks, Darren. Apart from that, we can't not let none of them in, because otherwise there would be nobody here, including me, including probably you, Darren, including the Home Secretary who's doing it, and an awful lot of else, right? It isn't, I think, though, but one of the things they've been talking about for this is that, former Labour Home Secretary Jack Straw has been saying, this is just, Mike says, what's Iran got to do with us? He spoke English and he thought we were nice. That's what that particular Iranian had to do with us. And maybe if he met you, he might feel differently.
We have quite a long history of Iran. We even tried to arrange a coup in the 1950s illegally to get rid of the Iranian government.
Yes,
we interfered in that country. We exploited our oil. We actually have a lot of history of Iran.
Yes, and that's £400 million we didn't pay, which we owed them, which led to Nazanin Zaghari Ratcliffe's release, and so on and so forth. That's what Iran's got to do with us. But there's a lot of people saying this is just red meat for the right wing of the Tory party, and that this is. There's also a piece in the leader column for the Mirror today, which you may have written, Jason. I don't know, but I suspect that someone has had a good deep think about this and saying, actually, this law is designed to fail. Despite the fact we've had these comments today, and I know there are some people saying that some people in the Tory party are racist and so on. They're a bit defamatory, so we're not going to republish those. But this is the kind of thing which appeases a certain part of the population. We've heard from some of them today, and it's red meat for them. And they go, yeah, brilliant. They've grown a backbone. This is great. The Tories are now doing what I want. They want to get votes for this. They want to get votes off the back of it. It's why they're doing it. But it says here in the Mirror, in the leader column, it's reasonable to wonder whether Rishi and Suella anticipate an unlawful ruling under the European Convention on Human Rights to spare their blushes, because they know this is going to fail. And they know it's illegal. And then we'll give them a fresh excuse and a fresh enemy. They can blame the European Convention on Human Rights, can't they?
But they're not even being subtle about this. On the front page of the illegal immigration bill, Suella Braverman has written, we're not entirely sure if this is legal or not, but we're going to press ahead with it anyway. It's quite interesting to have an illegal immigration bill. That's where we are. And they know what they're doing. It will go to the House of Lords, and they'll be able to blame the House of Lords, and then the lawyers will come in, and they'll always be lefty lawyers. They're never just normal lawyers, i.e. lawyers doing their job. And they'll be able to kind of bundle Keir Starmer into that lefty lawyer group, because Labour has reservations about her policy for perfectly kind of humanitarian reasons. And they'll go, we wanted to solve this, but the nasty lefty lawyers and their unelected peers and the blob, the establishment, and those awful civil servants.
Oh, it's judges again. The traitor judges.
Prevented us from doing it. So all the things which we should be proud of as countries, that we have a decent legal system and we have a proper opposition and that we actually have hold people to account, they will moan about because it's much easier to blame them for obstructing their ill thought out plans and actually take responsibility for a problem which is primarily of our own making. But hey, that's how it goes.
Yes, well, a bit like going back to that metaphor about the war on drugs. If your plan for deterring it is to arrest the customer and then criticize the police for not doing more of it, and somehow you're not actually working on the drug gangs, not really going to be an issue, is it? Now, perhaps stopping the reasons people take drugs in the first place, which might be poverty and misery and a lack of education. Now, Mike says, government is in real trouble in a few months when the migrants don't stop arriving and the deportations don't happen like they promise now for votes. They'll have to find another other to blame. That's the one thing. Before we move on to some good news, Jason, that slogan of stop the boats, that's going to end up being hung around their necks like a weight if they don't do it. They're going to go into a general election with stop the boats being hammered over their heads by Keir Starmer if they haven't done it, aren't they? It's a real risk.
But yeah, there's a kind of a few risks here for the Tories before they kind of start gloating too much about it. One is, although it may win votes in some areas, it threatens to kind of detoxify the party in others. It goes slightly against Sunak's own brand. He's come across as kind of Mr. Reasonable, Mr. Understanding, Mr. Sympathetic. Here he's trying to like be the biggest thug in the playground. It's not a natural look for him.
No.
There's the issue of the European Convention on Human Rights, which a lot of Tory MPs on the right want to withdraw from. Sunak has said that's not necessary. He may come under pressure to do so, so you could get internal Tory fighting on this. And then there is issue, if the plan really doesn't show any sign of stopping with small boats, what's he going to actually say? Kind of stop even smaller boats. I just don't, it's borrowed from the Australians, as one of the kind of commentators said earlier. It's exactly the same slogan that they used out there as well. But it does carry a lot of possibly kind of recognised kind of booby traps.
It does rather, and of course, Rishi's election campaign is probably going to be run by one of his Australian election gurus. So
is a man,
with the Tories. So it'd be quite unlikely that they'd use the same kind of techniques. Now, we've got a comment here who says, trust me, Rishi and Ursula have got this sewn up. Ursula, I think, is referring to Suella Braverman. Ursula, of course, being the villain from Little Mermaid. I hadn't really thought of the two in the same breath, but now we have. I think perhaps the fact that commenter is using the name Christian Knight's Line of Judah may imply that you're not incredibly friendly towards people of other faiths. But we'll have to wait and see, won't we? Do correct me if I'm wrong. Now, we do have some good news in the world. We'll have to wait and see how the illegal immigration bill works out and whether it is, as the Mirror predicts, just a feint to throw some red meat to the rest of the Tory party, which they expect to fail, and then they're just going to blame Europe for something, because that's what we've done for 1,000 years, ever since they've been William the Conqueror invaded. Oh, it's France's fault somehow or another. Everything.
I think that was France's fault.
No, it wasn't, because he was Norman, actually. He was a Viking. So, but then once he came over here, you see, then he blamed France for everything. Now, a little bit of historical context for you there, everyone. Now, we do have some good news in the world. Keep getting into the comments. What do you think about the illegal immigration bill? What do you think about the end of the NHS strikes? Where do you think that money should come from? For any of it, do you think asylum seekers should be allowed to work? Do you have any jobs that you need people to do and that there's no one in Britain prepared to do? Let us know. But first off, there is some good news, and here it is. Now, this is the story of Caitlin Houston, who is 6. She's from Wymondham in Norfolk, and she was born without a fully developed hand on her left arm. And when she goes out, she lets the sleeve hang over it. So, because people tend to look at it and stare at it and ask to see it and so on. Sometimes she's all right with it and sometimes she really isn't. But she has now been told she is a candidate for something called a hero arm. Fantastic, basically like Iron Man, but she would be able to play, fist bump, high five, grab, whatever, and hopefully be the object of some impressed fascination rather than this objectification she's had. Her family have launched a £13,000 GoFundMe. We're going to put a link to that in the comments, all right? Please, if you can bung her a fiver, because her family have set up this crowdfunder for her, which would give her an enormous lease of life and stop horrible people being a bit mean to her in public. But Jason, is this proof that whatever Mother Nature can't fix, the human ingenuity can?
This story is quite personal for me. My mother has exactly the same hand. She was born with the same what we used to call little hand. It's to say, it's looking at the photo, it's extraordinarily similar, and it's lovely. And I was just thinking that my 82-year-old mother could be a bionic gran or even a bionic great gran. It's wonderful.
It's great, isn't it? And because although her
Well,
fingers,
I'm saying that my mother never actually kind of ever complained. She just got on with life and did everything. You know, she's kind of balances cups of coffee on it, kind of, you know, played sport, kind of, you know, lived a full and lives a very happy life. But if this helps, even better.
Even better, isn't it? Amazing. It's because although she hasn't got the fully formed hand, she does have all the muscles in her arm which make your fingers move, and so they can just tap this sort of just patch it in, if you like, the wires onto the nerve endings and the muscles, and they can make the fingers move in the way that she's never been able to her whole life, which would be amazing. So if you've got a fiver, I know times are hard for everybody, but I think they're probably a lot harder for Caitlin. So bang her a fiver and help her out, everybody. Thank you for taking us through all that, Jason. Thank you, everyone, for taking part. Thank you to all our dear commenters. And we will see you all again next Monday for another edition of the News Agenda Explained. Bye, everybody.